Los Angeles in 1989 was a city of contrasts. Beverly Hills mansions sat just miles from Skid Row, where thousands of homeless people lived in cardboard boxes and makeshift tents. The wealthy drove past the poor every day without seeing them. That was the unwritten rule of Los Angeles. You didn't make eye contact with the people on the street. You pretended they didn't exist. Dean Martin had lived in Los Angeles for over 40 years. He had driven past homeless people thousands of times. He had never stopped, not once. It wasn't that he was cruel, he just didn't think about it. They were part of the scenery, like palm trees and traffic lights. You saw them, but you didn't really see them. On the evening of October 17, 1989, Dean Martin was 72 years old. He had been retired from performing for almost a year, ever since walking off the reunion tour with Frank Sinatra. He spent his days watching westerns on television, eating dinner alone at the same Italian restaurant every night, and waiting for something he couldn't name. His driver pulled up to La Familia, Dean's favorite restaurant on Cannon Drive. Dean stepped out of the car slowly. His knees weren't what they used to be, and started walking toward the entrance. "Dean? Dean Martin?" The voice came from the shadows near the alley beside the restaurant. Dean's instinct was to keep walking. His driver, a young man named Roberto, stepped forward protectively. "Sir, let me handle this." But Dean had already stopped. Something about the voice. Something familiar that he couldn't place. A figure emerged from the shadows. A homeless man, probably in his late 60s, with a gray beard that hadn't been trimmed in months, and clothes that were more holes than fabric. He was thin, too thin, and his hands were shaking. But his eyes. There was something about his eyes. "Dean," the man said again. "It's me, Tommy Fortunato." Dean felt the ground shift beneath his feet. Tommy Fortunato. He hadn't heard that name in 37 years. "Tommy?" Dean's voice was barely a whisper. "Tommy from Cleveland?" The homeless man smiled, revealing missing teeth. "You remember." Dean remembered. Cleveland, Ohio, 1952. Dean Martin was 35 years old and struggling. His partnership with Jerry Lewis was successful, but Dean felt trapped. He wanted to be taken seriously as a singer, not just as the straight man in a comedy duo. So on his rare nights off, he would slip away to small clubs and sing. Just sing, without the jokes, without Jerry, without the act. One of those clubs was called the Blue Moon, a tiny jazz joint on the east side of Cleveland. The owner, a gruff Italian named Sal Benedetto, had hired Dean for 3 nights. The pay was terrible, but Dean didn't care. He just wanted to sing. The house pianist was a young man named Tommy Fortunato, 23 years old, skinny as a rail, with fingers that danced across the piano keys like they were making love to them. Tommy was the best pianist Dean had ever worked with, and Dean had worked with a lot of pianists. They clicked immediately. Tommy understood Dean's phrasing, his timing, his need to let a note hang in the air before moving to the next one. Most accompanists tried to lead the singer. Tommy followed. He listened. He breathed with Dean, creating a partnership that felt almost telepathic. For 3 nights they made magic in that little club. The audiences were small, maybe 30 people on a good night, but they didn't care. They were playing for each other as much as for the crowd. On the last night after the final set, Dean and Tommy sat at the bar drinking cheap whiskey. "You're too good for this place, kid," Dean said. "You should be in New York, Los Angeles, playing for the big bands." Tommy shrugged. "I've got my mom here. She's sick. Can't leave her." "What's wrong with her?" "Cancer. Doctors say maybe a year, maybe 2. Dean was quiet for a moment. He knew about sick mothers. He knew about obligations that kept you tethered to places you wanted to escape. When you're free," Dean said carefully, "come find me. Wherever I am. I'll make sure you get a shot." Tommy smiled sadly. "That's kind of you, Mr. Martin. But we both know how these things work. You'll forget about me by next week." Dean put his hand on Tommy's shoulder. I won't forget. I promise. They shook hands. Dean gave Tommy his manager's contact information, written on a napkin. And then Dean went back to Los Angeles. Back to Jerry Lewis. Back to the life that was waiting for him. He never saw Tommy Fortunato again. Until now. 37 years later. On a sidewalk outside an Italian restaurant in Beverly Hills. I didn't come find you, Tommy said, his voice cracking. My mom died in '54. I could have come then. But I was too proud. Too stupid. I thought I'd make it on my own first, then come find you as an equal, not a beggar. Dean couldn't speak. His throat had closed up. I went to New York, Tommy continued. Played in clubs for a few years. Got a gig with a decent band. Things were looking up. Then I started drinking. Lost the gig. Lost everything. Tommy's hands were shaking harder now. Spent the next 30 years bouncing around, playing piano in bars when I could get work, sleeping on floors, then on benches, then on the street. He laughed bitterly. Funny thing is, I've been in Los Angeles for 5 years now. 5 years. I walked past this restaurant 100 times knowing you eat here, but I couldn't bring myself to approach you. I was too ashamed. Why tonight? Dean asked, his voice barely audible. Tommy looked at him with those familiar eyes, the same eyes that had sparkled with joy while playing piano in Cleveland, now dulled by decades of suffering. Because I'm dying, Dean. Doctor at the free clinic says my liver's shot. Maybe a month, maybe 2. And I realized I couldn't die without seeing you one more time. Without telling you. Tommy's voice broke. Without telling you that those 3 nights in Cleveland were the happiest nights of my life. Playing music with you, it was the closest I ever got to heaven. Dean Martin sat down. Not on a chair. There was no chair. He sat down right there on the sidewalk, his expensive Italian suit on the dirty concrete, next to a homeless man who smelled like the street, and he started to cry. Roberto, the driver, stood frozen. He had worked for Dean Martin for 2 years. He had never seen Dean show any emotion beyond mild amusement or mild irritation. Now his boss was sitting on a sidewalk, crying like a child. Mr. Martin, sir, should I? Get the car, Dean said through his tears. We're taking Tommy home. Home, sir? My home. Tommy tried to protest. Dean, no, I can't. Look at me. I'm filthy. You're coming home with me. Dean's voice was firm despite the tears. And we're going to talk. And then we're going to figure out what happens next. Dean's house on Mountain Drive was silent that night except for 2 voices talking until dawn. They sat in Dean's living room. Tommy had showered, shaved, and put on some of Dean's clothes that hung loosely on his thin frame. Dean had made coffee. Real coffee, not the instant stuff. He hadn't made coffee for anyone in years. I have to know, Dean said. What happened? After New York? Tommy stared into his coffee cup. Drinking. That's the simple answer. But it's not the whole answer. He took a breath. After my mom died, I went to New York like I planned. Got work pretty quickly. Turns out I was as good as you said I was. Played with some decent bands. Even got offered a spot with a big orchestra touring nationally. What happened? I turned it down. Can you believe that? The biggest opportunity of my life, and I said no. Why? Tommy was quiet for a long moment. Because I was scared, Dean. Scared of success. Scared of what would happen if I actually made it. See, as long as I was struggling, I had an excuse. I could tell myself that I was talented, just unlucky. But if I took that job, if I went on that tour, and I still didn't become somebody, then I'd have to face the truth. That maybe talent isn't enough. That maybe I just didn't have whatever it takes. He laughed bitterly. So I stayed small. Played in small clubs for small money. And when the fear got too loud, I drank to quiet it down. And the drinking made me worse at piano, which made me more scared, which made me drink more. Spiral. Down and down and down. Dean listened without interrupting. By 1965, I couldn't get steady work anymore. My hands shook too much. I started doing odd jobs, washing dishes, hauling boxes, whatever I could find. Lost apartments, lost friends, lost everything except the shame. Tommy looked at Dean. You know the worst part? I saw your movies. Every single one. I'd sneak into theaters when I could, or watch them on TVs in store windows. I saw you become Dean Martin, the real Dean Martin, not the guy singing in a Cleveland club for 30 people. I saw you on television with your own show. I saw you with Frank and Sammy, the coolest guys on the planet. His voice cracked. And every time I saw you, I thought, that could have been me, playing piano on that stage, being somebody. If only I hadn't been so scared. If only I'd had the courage you had. Dean shook his head slowly. You think I had courage? Tommy, I was terrified every day of my life. Still am. You? Dean Martin? You're the coolest man in the world. Dean laughed, a sad, tired laugh. That's the act, Tommy. That's the mask. Underneath it, I'm just a scared kid from Steubenville who still can't believe anyone wants to hear him sing. He leaned forward. You want to know a secret? I never stopped thinking about those 3 nights in Cleveland. Never. I've worked with the best pianists in the world. Guys who play for symphony orchestras. Guys who've won awards. None of them understood me like you did. You're just saying that. I'm not. Ask anyone who worked with me. Ask my arrangers. I spent years trying to find another pianist who could breathe with me the way you did. Never found one. Tommy was crying now. Silent tears running down his weathered cheeks. I wasted it, he whispered. I had a gift, and I wasted it. Maybe, Dean said. Or maybe you just took a longer road than most. The question isn't what you wasted. The question is what you do with whatever time you've got left. Dean stood up and walked to the corner of the room, where a beautiful grand piano sat, a Steinway, barely used. Dean had bought it years ago for parties, but the parties had stopped long before his son died. Now it just sat there collecting dust. Can you still play? Tommy looked at the piano like a drowning man looking at a life raft. I don't know. My hands. Try. Tommy walked slowly to the piano. He sat down on the bench. His fingers hovered over the keys, trembling. He pressed a chord. It was rough, uncertain. He pressed another. Better. And then, slowly, he began to play. It was That's Amore, the first song they had played together in Cleveland, 37 years ago. Tommy's fingers stumbled at first, missing notes, hitting wrong keys. But gradually, muscle memory took over. The music became smoother. The trembling lessened. Dean sat down next to him on the bench, and he began to sing. His voice wasn't what it used to be. 72 years of cigarettes and heartbreak had taken their toll. But he sang anyway, and Tommy played. And for a few minutes, they were back in that little club in Cleveland, making magic for an audience of no one. When the song ended, both men were crying. I forgot, Tommy whispered. I forgot what it felt like, to make music, to really make music. Dean put his arm around Tommy's thin shoulders. Then let's not forget again. Tommy Fortunato lived in Dean Martin's guest house for the next 3 months. Dean hired a doctor to monitor Tommy's health. He hired a nutritionist to help Tommy regain weight. He hired a therapist to help with the drinking, though Tommy had stopped on his own, saying he finally had a reason to stay sober. Every evening they would play together. Dean would sing, Tommy would accompany, and for an hour or two, they would both be young again. Dean's family was confused. His friends were baffled. Why was Dean Martin, the man who had withdrawn from everyone and everything, suddenly opening his home to a homeless stranger? Dean never explained. He didn't know how to explain. How do you tell people that a man who played piano for you in 1952 might be the only person left in the world who understands you? Tommy's health improved at first. Good food, clean living, and having something to live for can work miracles. But the liver damage was too severe. In January 1990, Tommy collapsed in the guest house. Dean was at his bedside in the hospital when he woke up. "I'm dying for real this time," Tommy said. "Aren't I?" "Yes." Tommy smiled weakly. "Thank you for not lying. Everyone lies to dying people." "I'm not everyone." "No, you're not." Tommy looked at the ceiling. "Dean, I need you to know something. These past 3 months, playing with you again, living in your home, feeling like a human being instead of a piece of garbage, these have been the second happiest months of my life." Second happiest? The happiest were those 3 nights in Cleveland. Nothing could ever top that. But these came close. Dean held Tommy's hand. It felt strange. 2 old men holding hands. But it also felt right. "I'm sorry," Dean said. "For what?" "For not looking harder. For not finding you. I could have. I had the money, the resources. I could have tracked you down years ago. Maybe I could have helped before it was too late." Tommy shook his head. "Don't do that. Don't take responsibility for my choices. I made my decisions. I dealt with the consequences. The only thing that matters is that you're here now." He squeezed Dean's hand weakly. "Besides, I wasn't ready to be found until I was ready. And I wasn't ready until that night outside the restaurant. Everything happened exactly when it was supposed to." Tommy Fortunato died on January 28, 1990. Dean paid for the funeral. A real funeral, in a real church, with real flowers. Only about a dozen people attended. Dean, his driver Roberto, the doctor who had treated Tommy, a few nurses who had grown fond of him. Dean didn't speak at the service. He couldn't. But he had arranged for a pianist to play "That's Amore" as the casket was carried out. After the funeral, Dean went home and sat at the Steinway. He stared at the keys for a long time. Then he started to play, badly, clumsily, hitting more wrong notes than right ones. He had never learned piano properly, but he played anyway. Because Tommy had taught him something in those final months. It's not about being perfect. It's about being brave enough to try. Dean Martin lived for 5 more years after Tommy Fortunato died. He never performed publicly again. He rarely left his house. But every evening he would sit at that piano and play, terribly, awkwardly, but persistently. His housekeeper, a woman named Rosa, later said that she often heard Dean talking while he played. Talking to someone who wasn't there. "Is that okay, Tommy? Did I get that chord right? No? Let me try again." She didn't think it was strange. She thought it was beautiful. When Dean Martin died on Christmas Day 1995, his family found a napkin in his desk drawer. Old, faded, carefully preserved in a plastic sleeve. On it was written an address that no longer existed and a name that most people had never heard. Tommy Fortunato, the Blue Moon Club, Cleveland. At the bottom of the napkin in Dean's handwriting, added decades later, "I should have looked for you sooner, but at least I found you before the end. Save a seat for me at that piano." They say Dean Martin died of respiratory failure. They say his heart finally gave out after years of emphysema and grief. But Rosa, the housekeeper who had watched him play that piano every night for 5 years, had a different theory. "Mr. Martin didn't die of a broken heart," she said. "He died of a full one. He finally had nothing left to wait for. Tommy had saved him a seat, and Mr. Martin was ready to take it." The Steinway piano is still in Dean Martin's house, which is now owned by another family. They don't know its history. They don't know about the 2 old men who sat at that bench and made magic together, 37 years after making magic in a Cleveland jazz club. But sometimes late at night the family swears they can hear music coming from that room. 2 voices, one singing, one playing, creating harmonies that sound like heaven. They've had the house checked. There's no explanation. Some things don't need explanations. Some things just need to be heard.